Welcome back, dear students, in the second semester of F.Y.B.Sc, and I'm Dr. Savita Tidame. I am going to teach subject Zoology paper 2, that is cell biology, with the subject code ZO122, that is 122. Okay, so in the present lecture, we'll be starting with the chapter number 3, that is plasma membrane. Okay, so the structure, chapter number 3 is the structure and function of the cell membrane. We'll study entire things, that is structure of the plasma membrane, as well as the chemical composition of the plasma membrane, as well as what is the percentage of the protein, lipid, carbohydrate in the plasma membrane, and along with that the fluid mosaic model of the plasma membrane, even the transport, that is active transport, passive transport across the membrane of the plasma membrane, as well as the function of the plasma membrane, why the plasma membrane is there, as well as what function does it perform, right? So that entire things which we are going to study in this lecture or under this chapter. So all cells are covered by a very thin membrane, right? See, this is the animal cell. This is a Google diagram. This is the animal cell, and it has been covered by, if you see carefully, it is covered by a layer, double layered membrane, right? A layer is there which is going to form a boundary. Okay, so all cells are covered by a very thin membrane called as a plasma membrane or plasmolemma, which is not visible under light microscope. So under light microscope means a compound microscope, right? Or if you see, you cannot find the definite boundary, right? But under the light microscope, whatever structure is there, you can see a specific shape of the cell. This is because of the cell membrane. So the cell membrane is made up of a plasmolemma and surrounded cell cement, right? So plasmolemma along with a surrounded cell cement forms a cell membrane, and this plasma membrane may be protected by other coverings, like plasma membrane of the egg is supported by the vitelline membrane. So plasma membrane in various types or in other cells may be covered with the secondary membranes like vitelline membrane, or in the jelly like layer is also present sometimes, both of which are secreted by the ovary, right? So plasma membrane is present around the cell as a limiting structure or limiting boundary for the cell. Now let's move ahead and see the chemical composition of the cell membrane. Now the plasma membrane is made up of lipoprotein. That means it is made up of lipid and protein. What it is made up of? Lipoprotein, lipid and protein. And these are special non-bonded combination of the lipid with the proteins. So lipids and proteins, they are present in the plasma membrane with a varying percentage, and in that the membrane contains 60% of the protein. What is the percentage of the protein? It is a 60% of the protein. And dear students, there is a slight correction, not 60% but 50% protein. Plasma membrane contains 50% protein, not 60. Okay, and it contains 40% lipids and a very little amount, that is 10% of the carbohydrate by dry weight of the plasma membrane, right? So plasma membrane contains 50% protein, 40% lipid and 10% carbohydrate by the dry weight, right? So the proteins, let's focus on the proteins, which are and what are the different types of protein present in the plasma membrane. So on the basis of their functions, proteins of the plasma membrane are classified as a structural proteins, enzymes, carriers, right? So structural proteins, these proteins forms the backbone of the cell membrane, and their average molecular weight is 3 × 10⁴ dalton, right? So these proteins forms a backbone. These are the structural unit of the cell. They involved in formation of a specific structure to the cell, right? So they called as a backbone of the cell or structural proteins, right? And then the second one is enzymes. So the structural enzymes which are major component of plasma membrane are the catalytic proteins. So on the cell membrane, let me show you the diagram. Okay, so this is a diagram of the cell. So on the cell membrane, on the outside of the cell and inside, some molecules are different, right? So molecules which interact with the extracellular surface, right? They further catalyze or they further utilized and modified or either transported inside the cell through the plasma membrane, right? As well as some proteins, they react with the plasma membrane molecules, that is enzymes, and after that the plasma membrane undergoes certain kind of changes. So enzymatic activities are shown by the proteins. So that structural enzymes they called, which are the major component of the plasma membrane, are catalytic proteins. They carry out the reaction on the cell surface, right? So they called as a catalytic protein, or they called as a enzymes. Now the carrier proteins. So some proteins are there which act as a carrier. Carrier is nothing but what? It is nothing but a molecule which permit or which permeates the entry of specific molecule across the membrane. So carrier proteins are also called as permeases, as they transport substances across the membrane against a concentration gradient. So like this, suppose this is a globular protein or protein embedded in the plasma membrane. It helps in carrying the molecule across the plasma membrane like this. So it is also called as a carrier protein, right? So after that, their molecular weight is similar to that of the structural proteins. So carrier proteins are also very large in number, and their average molecular weight is nearby 3 into 10 raised to 4 Daltons. So according to their position, this is what on the basis of their function performed by the proteins in the plasma membrane, they were categorized into structural proteins, enzymes, and carrier proteins, right? And on the basis of their position, right, on the basis of their position in the plasma membrane, the proteins of the plasma membrane are of two types. Some proteins, as they are present on the external surface, right? Some proteins, as they are present on the external surface as well as the internal surface, not expanding across the membrane. So this is a lipid bilayer. Okay, this is a lipid bilayer. We'll discuss about it in detail. So not expanding across the membrane. All the blue colored globes are nothing but what? They are nothing but the proteins, and the small head and tails are nothing but the lipid. Okay, so all these are the proteins. So if you see here, this is what the transmembrane protein, or it is found to be embedded into the plasma membrane, that is embedded into the lipid bilayer. It is facing to the external side of the cell as well as the internal side. This is also facing external side of the cell as well as the internal. So it is called as a transmembrane protein or integral protein. Okay, it is also called as a integral protein or a transmembrane protein. Some proteins which are found to be present on the periphery, not expanding the membrane, not invading the membrane, so they called as a peripheral proteins, right? They called as a peripheral proteins or surface proteins, or also they called as the extrinsic proteins, right? Some are which are present on the internal side called as intrinsic. Some proteins not expanding the cell membrane completely, found on the external side, called as a extrinsic proteins. So intrinsic proteins and extrinsic proteins. So integral proteins, intrinsic, also called as integral. These are the transmembrane proteins that pass through the plasma membrane, right? Like this, right? Like this. Integral proteins, they are expand through the plasma membrane, and they form channels for transport of the substances inside the cell and outside the cell through the plasma membrane. Like this, it forms a channel for transport of the plasma membrane or for the transport of the molecules across the plasma membrane. So this is called as a intrinsic proteins. Extrinsic proteins, or they are also called as a peripheral proteins, which are attached loosely to the plasma membrane. Outer part of the plasma membrane by means of the ionic bond or calcium bridge are known as the extrinsic or the peripheral proteins. Now these extrinsic proteins and intrinsic proteins. Extrinsic, which are the peripheral proteins, they are very loosely, as they are attached with the cell membrane with the help of a calcium bridge, so they are easily get detached, easily get isolated from the cell. And the integral proteins, they are expanding, they are they are found to be present across the membrane, right, embedded into the membrane, so they are very difficult to dissociate. Okay, so what we have studied right now, we have studied the chemical composition of the cell membrane, right? In that, proteins on the basis of classification of a protein on the basis of their function as well as on the basis of their position in the plasma membrane, right? Now let's move ahead and see the lipids. There are two types, as we said earlier. 50% is the protein, 40% is the lipid, and 10% is the carbohydrate. So let's start with the lipid. So there are two types of a lipid associated with the plasma membrane. They are called as a polar lipids, right? Two types of lipids associated with the plasma membrane, they are called as a polar lipids. In the membrane, lipids present in the form of a phospholipid, glycolipid, and the sterols, right? So these lipids contains hydrophilic head and hydrophobic tail. So this simple diagram is showing you the hydrophilic head. So say this is a bilayer, lipid bilayer, okay, and whatever globular head-like structure you are seeing on the periphery as well as on the inner side, this head or globular structure is called as a head, which is a hydrophilic, right, which is a hydrophilic, water loving, so it comes in contact with the water. But the tail portion of the each lipid molecule, so that is hydrophobic, water hating. So this tail portion, hydrophobic, comes to the center or core, and it forms a hydrophobic core. So the lipid bilayer is hydrophilic on either side, that is on the external as well as on the internal side, and hydrophobic core. So this internal core of the lipid bilayer or plasma membrane is hydrophobic. Let me show you the same in this diagram. So if you see here, you can see number of the phospholipid molecules. So this all phospholipid, or this all small head-like structure with the two tails, are nothing but the lipid. So this plasma membrane contains a lipid, filled with the lipid, right? So there are two types of molecules, two phospholipid molecules in a single line. So this is one layer and this is another parallel layer. So these heads of the phospholipid, they are what? They are hydrophilic, right? They are water loving, so they comes in contact with the aqueous substances on outer side as well as on the inner side. But if you see the tail portion of this phospholipid bilayer is hydrophobic, and hence it comes together to form a hydrophobic core. So if you see the plasma membrane, this is what? A plasma membrane present around the cell. Just a second. Okay, so this is what? A animal cell, and this small layer you are seeing on the outer side, boundary layer, is said to be the plasma membrane. It is further magnified here, and this forms a core, which is a hydrophobic, water hating, don't allow water to cross, right, the plasma membrane very easily. Let me show you the video, that so that we'll understand the mechanism very easily. But before that, plasma membrane lipids are of three types. In the plasma membrane, three types of lipids are there. Phospholipid, which is nothing but the most abundant lipid here. This entire lipid, entire head and tail portion, that is said to be phospholipid, which forms the bilayer of the lipid in the plasma membrane. Then another one type is the cholesterol, right, and glycolipids. Okay, so cholesterol, here is shown a cholesterol, yellow colored structure is the cholesterol, which is again very low in amount, right, very small in amount. This cholesterol is there, and then the glycolipids, which is nothing but a oligosaccharide derivative associated with the lipid molecule, right. So three types of lipids are there: phospholipid, which forms a major part of the lipid bilayer, then cholesterol, which is again less in number, and the glycolipids, which are again very less in number. So let me show you the diagram video explaining this mechanism. Here, this is a phospholipid molecule which we have seen is in the lipid bilayer, right? And this phospholipid molecule is now having this head portion, that is a phosphate group, which is the hydrophilic group, right? Chemical composition is given here, and whatever tail is there, that is a hydrophobic, that is called as a water hating, right? So this hydrophilic head and hydrophobic, that is amphiteric or amphipathic lipid molecule, is arranged in a bilayer form that faces the hydrophilic head facing outer side here like this. It is facing outer side. All these, whatever is the heads are there which are hydrophilic in nature, and that is facing towards the outer side as well as towards the inside of the cell. And as you know that the cell inside and cell outside is what it is carrying, or it is nothing but the water, or you can say hydrophilic portions, where the cellular entities, or you can say blood, or you can say hemolymph, number of things like molecules, biomolecules, they come in contact with the outer portion, cell inner side as well as cell outer side, right? So the hydrophilic, most of them, they are hydrophilic in nature. So this lipid bilayer is also facing outer side is hydrophilic, that's why. And whatever core is formed, that core is nothing but the hydrophobic. And dear students, whatever structures are embedded, these are nothing but the protein molecules. These are the extrinsic proteins, and these are intrinsic or integral. Better, they are called as integral proteins, right? So these integral proteins and extrinsic, that is intrinsic proteins and extrinsic proteins, they worked coordinately as in membrane proteins or globular proteins, and they also involved, that is intrinsic proteins are also involved in the transport of many molecules across the cell membrane, that is from cell inside to cell outside and cell outside to cell inside. Let me show you in this video. So you can see here this channel, protein channel is open, that transport the molecule towards inside of the cell. Here you can see here, now this channel will get open. Yes, cell from cell inside, the material is now transported to cell outside. So whatever material, maybe the excretory material or waste material which is accumulated inside the cell, that is need to be transported across the membrane, right, need to thrown outside. So that cell is transporting that waste material from cell inside to cell outside through the channels or through the transmembrane protein, right, like this. You can see it one more time. Yes, see, this is what the waste material accumulated inside the cell. Now through the channel get open, material is thrown out. Again, next time what happened, the material from cell outside, that is maybe the nutrient from cell outside, is now taken inside the cell through the same channels, through the same pores. So the cell membrane act as a transmembrane protein or channels for entry as well as the exit of the molecule across the cell membrane. Then the carbohydrate chains, that is the glycoprotein chains, which are also associated with the cell membrane, especially with the lipids. If they are associated with the protein molecules, they are called as the glycoproteins, and if they are associated with the lipid molecule, they are called as glycolipid molecules. They are playing important role for the cellular recognition, right? Okay, now let's see what is next in this video. Okay, this plasma membrane bilayer, lipid bilayer is there. Again, the same video is shown, that is entry and outside, that is exit of the molecule across the membrane with the help of this transmembrane proteins. See, cholesterol is also present between the lipid bilayer, that is one of the part of a lipid, and this cholesterol is again functioning for the cell, right? Okay, so after this, we have in this video what we have studied now. We have studied the structure of the protein, peripheral and integral proteins, or extrinsic and intrinsic protein, then lipids, their location, fluidity of the lipid, how the molecules they have been transported across the membrane, that entire things which we have studied in the present lecture. In next lecture we will be studying the fluid mosaic model of the plasma.